Hey, good morning. It's good to see you guys. Welcome this week. We're in our final week of Share Hope. We're excited about that. I want to let you know what's coming up starting next week. So how many of you have heard of the television show Ted Lasso? Is there a few? Yeah, and some random applause that I wasn't expecting. So great. If you're unaware of this TV show, it's taken the nation by storm over the last couple of years. It's won a ton of Emmy awards, and the third and I think final season is going to premiere in maybe a couple months. They're keeping it quiet right now. We're not sure. But we were kind of as a staff one day talking about like, why is this show so popular? And one of the reasons it's so popular is because it's a feel-good show. It's a very positive show. And Ted Lasso is an American football coach who moves to the UK to coach a soccer team knowing nothing about soccer. I mean, just the premise is good. But he's also got a ton of folksy wisdom. As we talked about like some of the points that the show makes, what we found is like, you know what's so resonant about the show is that so much of the points it makes are actually rooted in kind of the wisdom that Jesus gave us so long ago. And so starting next week, we're doing a kind of unusual series that we're just calling TED Talks. And we're going to talk about like some of the wisdom of Jesus and living out, how do I apply the teachings of Jesus to my everyday, ordinary life? What does that look like? And then we'll point to, every week we'll point to an episode of Ted Lasso where they talked about a really similar concept. So that starts next week, October 30th through the 27th. That doesn't make sense. Through November 27th, that makes more sense. Would love for you to join us for that and hope that you'll come back then. All right, so last week of Share Hope. I want to let you know that at the end of today, what we're driving toward is we're going to be taking up a special offering. And the special offering is one that is going to not stay at Inland Hills Church. So we're taking up a Share Hope offering today at the end of our service, and every dollar that we receive of the Share Hope offering goes outside of our walls in order to bless the world all around us. And so as we conclude our series, this is kind of what we've been driving toward, and we hope that if this is the first time you're hearing about this, that even now you may start to prayerfully consider what it is that God may lay on your heart to give. And if you've been thinking about it for the last couple of weeks, we hope that you'll prayerfully consider as we move through the service today. As we think about sharing hope, kind of the passage that we start with on this is from 1 Timothy chapter 6. There's the Apostle Paul, who's one of the very first Christians, and this is what he wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He says, "Teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment." So he says essentially like, look, God is reliable, money is not reliable. How many of you feel that deeply right now, right? Inflation continues to go up, gasoline prices like, yin and yang like constantly. Like, yes, money is not reliable. The stock market's all over the place. Our 401ks are, changing, it seems like all the time, often for the worse right now. Like, yeah, money doesn't feel like it's super reliable. So don't put your trust in that, he says. Rather, put your trust in God. And when you do that, you'll use everything that you have, including that unreliable money, in order to further the purposes of God. He goes on and says this, "Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future so that they may experience true life." There is a life that they will experience that is true if they spend their time and their money pursuing good in the world, right? One thing that we said in our first week of this was that the church should be a force for good in the world. And we get this from Paul here, we get it from Jesus and how he led his disciples, we get it all over the New Testament. Here's the interesting thing, if you're a follower of Jesus, just something for you to know, and we've said this here before, there's a lot of churches in the church network that we're a part of that say this all the time. It's a phrase that's become very handy. If you don't know about this about Jesus, it's helpful to know it. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. In other words, there are a few ways that you can try and be a Christ follower in the world. And one of them is to try and live your life in the way that Christ lived his. That's the hope. But sometimes what happens is people instead feel like, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, and therefore, I'm holy or I'm righteous, and therefore my real goal is to just judge the world. But what Jesus did was he came and he interacted with so many people, Roman soldiers, centurions, prostitutes, tax collectors, so many people who would have been considered the dregs of society, and he interacts with them in such a way that they are compelled to consider what it is he has to say. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus because they got the sense that Jesus was always for them, that Jesus was a force of good for the world. And even when he chastised them, when he showed them a better way to live than they were currently living, they felt that he did it out of love. It's one of the reasons that we feel like as a church, everyone around us ought to know what we're for. They ought to know that we are for them, for their flourishing, for the good of the community, the cities, the nation, the world. That's what we're for because we're followers of Christ. And God has put in us a love for other people that is an uncommon kind of love. It's a love for other people that says, like because of the way we understand the world to work, we believe every single person is created in the image of God. Every single person has infinite worth. And because of that belief, we want to see the world be a better and better place in the name of Jesus. It's why we feel compelled then to share hope. That's why we're doing what we're doing. Now, what I want to talk about for a few minutes this morning is something that I think is a real threat to sharing hope with the world. So we're going to talk about that for a few minutes. Then we're going to talk about how to share hope, and then we're going to take up our offering, and we'll be done for the day, okay? My father, his name is David. My father is an evangelist. He's traveled all around the world sharing the gospel of Jesus, the story of Jesus, and inviting other people to follow after him. My father's a great guy. He's a great husband. He was a great father, continues to be. But my father is colorblind, really, really colorblind. And at times, it's been unhelpful for us. So the kind of colorblind he is the kind that you cannot see the color red if it's on a black background. So for instance, you've probably seen an alarm clock that looks something like this, right? So for my dad, this same alarm clock looks exactly like this, right? Not helpful at all. It's just the shape of a clock, really. And so it's funny because a lot of churches have, at the back of the auditorium, they'll have the time so that the preacher can know when he's going too long, right? So the preacher can look back and he or she can say I'm going too long. I need to shorten the sermon or cut that point out or whatever. But so when my dad preaches in other churches and they have this clock at the back, he sees that. So he just goes as long as he wants to. No problem, right? I'm just going to, sorry, I couldn't see the clock. It wasn't on right or something, right? When he was in high school, he grew up in a really small town called Grand Saline, Texas, and they had exactly one red light, and it looked a lot like this, right? Up and down. Then he moved to Waco, Texas for college, and they had a sideways red light, which he had never seen before. And because he couldn't tell what color the lights were, he started stopping on green and going on red. So he got a ticket. He tried to explain to the officer, I'm colorblind. I couldn't quite understand it. The officer had no desire to hear that whatsoever, so he got a ticket. And then I remember a few years ago, we were living in Chicago, and my parents were coming into town, and so they asked, what would you guys like to do when we're in town? And we were college students at the time, and what we always liked to do when our parents came into town was, to have them spend money on us. So we're like, if we could go to dinner and maybe a play, that'd be really fun. So we went to go see Wicked, which was a Broadway musical that played in Chicago for several years as well. Wicked is the retelling of The Wizard of Oz with an empathetic view of the Wicked Witch. Her name is Elphaba in the play, and so she is disliked by people. People are wary of her because she's different, right? She's green. No one else is green, so she comes out on stage, and she is very, very green. And so all of her classmates, she's at college, and all of her classmates don't want anything to do with her, and so that's kind of her origin story a little bit. So we get to intermission of this play, and my dad looks over at Mom, and he says, hey, why does nobody want anything to do with the Elphaba girl? I don't understand. Did I miss a plot point or something? And my mom said, no, she's green. He said, what? She's the color of her skin is green. He said, really? She said, yeah. I said, I just thought she was very tan or Italian maybe. And I was like, why does everyone hate Italians in this place? This doesn't make any sense to me. He was really trying to figure it out, right? So we're talking about this on the phone this week. I was talking to him about this story. And I got off the phone with him, and then my mom called me back a few minutes later, and she was like, Josh, I was just here with your dad, and I said to him, hey, did it never occur to you that she was green? You know that the witch in The Wizard of Oz is green. Did you not put that together? And he said, the witch in The Wizard of Oz is green? Right? He's almost 70 years old and never knew it before. It's amazing. All right, so I found a couple of ways of understanding what the world looks like if you're colorblind. This is a picture, right? A beautiful garden observatory kind of thing. If you're colorblind like my dad is, it probably looks something like this. Yeah, and you can see how that's really, really different, right? So my dad's colorblindness is not just an attribute of his. My dad's colorblindness is actually a lens through which he sees the entire world. Everything looks different because of his colorblindness. Cynicism has seeped deeply into our culture. And increasingly, cynicism is no longer just an attribute of our culture, but it has become a lens through which so many of us see everything that we see. If we're not careful, cynicism will become the lens through which we see the world. And this is going to be a major, major hindrance to the possibility of us sharing hope with other people. So just so we're on the same page, right? Really simple definition of cynicism. It's an inclination to believe that people are motivated purely by self-interest. It's skepticism, right? you'll hear people say things like, well, all politicians are just out for power, or all churches just want your money. Ironic, since we're going to ask you to give a special offering at the end of this service. But still, it's not for us. We're giving it all away, okay? Or you'll hear people say like, oh, well, all men are idiots, or all women are neurotic, right? There's just like, people have these deep opinions about people. They just make these blanket statements about all groups, right? And there's just a cynical way of understanding the world. The comedian George Carlin, who was brilliant, intelligent guy, comedian George Carlin, toward the end of his life, he got increasingly cynical. And he made a statement about cynicism, which I think is helpful to see. And here's the thing, if you look up on YouTube, like interviews with George Carlin in the last few years of his life, what you'll find is he will literally say out loud that he has given up on the human race. And he thinks that we're just circling the drain and we're all gonna go down. And he wishes he could live for another 1,000 years so that he could just kind of step back and watch it happen. This is a man who started off his career by doing the hippy dippy weatherman. Hippy dippy weatherman, dude. Like it was that kind of like, that was his big comic bit. And by the end of his life, while he had some brilliant insights into some of the issues and problems that we have in our society, he'd become so cynical that he said out loud he had completely given up on the human race. And George Carlin says this about cynicism. He says, inside every cynical person, there is a disappointed idealist. How do we get cynical? We get cynical because of unmet expectations. Right? We get cynical because of unmet expectations. Carey Nieuwhof, a pastor and author, he says it this way. Cynicism begins not because you don't care, but because you do care. It starts because you poured your heart into something and got little in return. Or maybe you got something in return, but it was the opposite of what you desired. Carey Nieuwhof, in his book, Didn't See It Coming, he tells a story about how when he first started a church, he started at a church in Canada, the Toronto area. There was a family that came after he'd been there just a few weeks. And they came and they were a family that didn't have much money. And he said over the next several years, what was awesome to see was that our church just totally poured into them. Over and over again, people would provide money for them to pay their utility bills, or they would provide a place for them to stay, or they would sometimes provide food for them. And he was like, over and over and over several years, we just poured into this family, tried to give them job training, all kinds of stuff. And he said he remembered the church was getting a little bit larger, and so as the church was getting a little bit larger, their needs were still being met, but they just weren't as much the center of attention, simply because attention had been spread out to more people now. And he said they were having like a fellowship dinner together with the whole church. The church started at like 20, and now the church it was huge. It was like 60. And so they were gathered around tables, and they were eating one day. And he said the kind of matriarch of this family, the whole family stood up and looked at him and said something like, Carey, we're leaving and we're never coming back because you guys just don't care about us anymore. You haven't done enough for us. And they walked out. And that was the last time he saw them. Even though he called, tried to get back in touch, like he never saw them again. You haven't done enough for us. And he felt like he had spent hours and hours and weeks and months over several years trying to help them, connect them with people who could help them. He had given them money out of his own pocket. He had collaborated with others to take care of their needs. And like at the end, it just felt like it wasn't enough. And it's easy to start to get cynical when you pour yourself into something and somebody tells you, sorry, not enough. Not enough. For myself, I grew up in a church. And I love the church I grew up in because lots of adults poured their hearts and lives into mine. I really felt like I mattered to God and that I mattered to people when I was a kid because of how much people like poured their life into mine. In fact, we had, when I was starting in first grade, you could go to this thing called Children's Church. And it was run by a guy, I still don't remember their last names. It was Brother George and Sister Cheryl is what we called them. And they were a little bit older. And here's what I didn't realize when I was a kid. They were really weird. They were very unusual people. And I loved them because they were so welcoming. And they worked with kids every week. And so what they would do every week, right, is there was like a puppet show that they would do. And then they would teach a story out of the Bible. And they would just let us know over and over how much God cared about us. And you know, when you're a child and you're still learning about the world and you don't know about all the danger and all the other stuff out there, like it's very important at a formative age to start to understand the God who created you and loves you so much. He sent his only son so that you might have connection with him. Like that was very important for me, very formative for me. And when you got into 4th or 5th grade, they started letting you be a part of running the puppet show. highlight of my life as a kid. It was amazing. And so you would stay after for 10 or 15 minutes after it was over, and they would just teach, several of us how to run the puppets, and we'd practice for the next week, and we'd come back so that we could pour into the kids. And you know what? They were unusual people. They were unusual people. But they were willing to give of their time in a church setting and let some kids know that they mattered to God and that they mattered to adults. And I didn't think about their unusualness until I was probably well into my 20s. And then honestly, I appreciated it all the more. There are people who are unusual. They probably knew that they're unusual, and they just leaned in and poured into the lives of others because they felt like it was what God wanted them to do. So growing up in church, I felt really good about church in general. And then I became a pastor. And it didn't take long after stepping onto a church staff to start to realize that, when you're in this role, people don't just determine your value or your worth by your participation or your belonging to the community. They start to just look at you and have a very different criteria. And they can't help it. It's a very natural thing to do. But suddenly, what I believed about tiny little parts of theology out on the periphery became very, very important to a few people. I had a mentor of mine this is several years ago at a different church. I had a mentor of mine several years ago. This is a person who was, he's probably 35 years my senior, had started inviting me out to lunch regularly as soon as I stepped into the lead pastor role of this church. I really appreciated him. He had my family over to his family's house for dinner several times, and he helped me understand the community a lot. He prayed for me. We didn't see eye to eye on everything, but that was okay because he was willing to pour into my life, and I was willing to pour into his, and I appreciated that so much. And then that guy, who to this day I still love, but this what I'm about to tell you breaks my heart, he ended up trying to get me fired because we had a slightly different understanding of the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. And he believed that was enough that I should be fired. And he wrote not just to my church elders, but to the whole denomination to try and get me fired. And once you do that, right, you've thrown the flag out on the field. It's too late. You can't take it back. He got way out over his skis, and so he left the church. And I've reached out to him several times. I haven't heard from him since, right? Cynicism doesn't start because you don't care. It starts because you do care. You pour your life into somebody only to see them reject you. You give and you give and give only to be told that it's not enough. That's where cynicism begins. It's deep disappointment. It's deep disappointment. And so when you become really cynical, what you start to do is you start to disappoint yourself before the world can do it for you. Oh, well, I've just expected the worst to happen and for people to be terrible because then I'll either be pleasantly surprised or at least I won't be deeply disappointed. I was talking with a friend of mine this week, and we just started talking about the millennial generation. Millennials are those who were born between 1981 and 1996. I was born in 1981, so I'm like a grandpa millennial is what I am, okay? And we were just talking about just in the lifetime of the millennial generation, right? There are people who are in their upper 20s to 40. What is it that they have walked through? What have they experienced just in the U.S. in their lifetime? And this is just a list. It's certainly not exhaustive, but for those of you who've been around for this long or longer, it'll be familiar to you, okay? First major scandal I remember as a kid was the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal in 1998, right? And that was on the news constantly. And I remember, right, I grew up in the church, so I heard a lot of opinions about this through pastors and preachers on television and politicians. And what they said over and over and over again was, hey, character matters. And the president of the United States has done this wrong thing, but he's also lied about this thing, and character really, really matters. And so whoever's in the White House, we ought to care if they're the kind of person that is honest and decent, if they're the kind of person who will, be content in a monogamous relationship, or if their eyes will always go wandering. That was really important. Pastors all over the U.S. were talking about how much character mattered in the White House. And I remember that being, in direct opposition to what we were seeing out of the White House at that time. And then I remember September 11th in 2001, right? I was in college. And I remember that I got out of bed that morning with a weird feeling that something wasn't right, and I pulled up AOL News, for those of you who remember that, right? America Online. You've got mail, that guy. And I saw a still picture of an explosion, what looked like an explosion in the World Trade Center. And I remember turning on the television and watching that tower that had been hit. And then I saw in real time the second one get hit. And then by this time, a lot of guys were in my room. We were all watching it. And we saw both of those towers fall. And it was just like, oh my goodness, what is happening? And we didn't know, right? The not knowing in the hours that came later, what's next? What's going to happen next? How many people just perished? it was unlike anything we'd ever experienced before at that point in my life. And then that led to the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, right? 2001, really until 2021. Lots of people that I knew, friends of mine, ended up getting deployed to Afghanistan or to Iraq. We lost a lot of people in those wars. And so we walked through that. And then we started to, the global financial crisis in 2008. I had been told my whole life, that the one thing you definitely should invest in as soon as you can is a house, because housing values, they always just go up and to the right. And so as soon as you can, you should invest in that. So in early 2008, my wife and I were like, let's invest in a house. And at the end of 2008, we're like, what's wrong with everybody? We were told this would be good. And we lost a ton of money. We had to bring extra money to the table. It just it was a bad experience for us. And so we walked through that. And then that was even worse for some of you than that, for sure. Then there was the evangelical about face. And I have had dozens at this point, dozens of millennials come and talk to me and say that they don't understand what they're seeing right now in the world because they were told in the late 90s that character mattered in politicians when it was Bill Clinton, but then when it was Donald Trump, they were told that we're electing a president, not a pastor. And it's not about politics for them. It's not about Republicans versus Democrats. They just don't understand why some of the same leaders who cared about character in the late 90s suddenly defended someone with bad character in the 2016 election and beyond. And what they see is just hypocrisy. Like, why did it matter when the guy was on the other team, but when he's on our team, we don't care? Like, that's right. If you grew up in that conservative kind of political mindset, like, why did it matter when the guy was on the other team that was, and he's part of a Democrat, but he was a progressive. Now that it's someone running for the conservative team, like we become his lawyers and we defend everything he does. Like, that doesn't seem to make sense. And so there was, for a lot of millennials, right, a major disconnect between those two events because they were alive and they were around for both of them. And they saw some of the same people make opposite arguments depending on who it was we were talking about. And again, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about Republicans versus Democrats. It was about, like, what do we do? What do we do with character? And so that you can become cynical when you start to see that. And then, 2020, you may remember this, we had a global pandemic. And then this year we've had global inflation, and we're moving into a recession, possibly, depending on who you talk to. Some people say we're already there. And it's not just in the US, it's worldwide. We have supply chain constraints and inflation. Like, it's just rough. And if all this wasn't bad enough, they prematurely canceled Arrested Development in 2006. That was a great TV show, right? So there's a lot of reasons, I get it, there's a lot of reasons to be cynical. There's a lot of reasons to think like, oh, they're always in it for the power. They're always in it for the money. They're always just looking after themselves. Oh, even when people do good, they only do it so that other people will see them doing it and they'll get credit for it. That's what the cynic says. And the cynic starts to believe that they alone kind of see the world as it really is. And everybody else who doesn't see it with that kind of negative, cynical view, they're just kidding themselves. And so you can start to actually feel a bit superior about this after a while. Like, oh, you have hope? Ha, 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 that's cute. Right? You can start to feel like, oh, if you have hope, you're just not paying attention. You're not being honest with yourself. That's what it can start to feel like. Which, of course, I think that ought to drive us back to Scripture. Like, how did the early church, the first followers of Jesus, how did they think about this? Because let's not kid ourselves. The world was not any easier in the first century than it is now. Right? They had every reason to be cynical. The Roman government persecuted the first Christians for decades after the gospel of Jesus started to spread. I mean, they were persecuted, like literally persecuted, killed for their faith. That's what was happening to them in the first century. They were imprisoned and flogged and told to recant and told that they needed to stop saying Jesus is Lord because they needed to start saying Caesar is Lord. Like, that's the early church. So what did they do? Did they just get like, well, everybody's just out for power. It's all just terrible. I guess we just ought to like huddle together and hope that heaven comes quickly. No. Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he writes this. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. In other words, like, hey, there's a group of us. There's a group of us that have hope. And you would think if you were going to inspire the world with hope, you would put hope in something that's really solid and really strong. But actually it's in us, and we're really fragile, and they're actually like persecuting us and going against us. And we have feelings about things, and our feelings can whip around from one day to the next. Like, we're fragile. We're like jars of clay. And yet God has seen fit to store the hope of the world in us. Because we know something that much of the world does not. This makes it clear that our great power, it's from God, it's not from us. Like we're holding the hope, but it's not because we're so awesome. It's because God is so good. He goes on, we are pressed on every side by troubles, but we're not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down. By the way, literally hunted down. Paul had actually been one of the ones who was literally hunting Christians down. He knew this more than anybody. Before his conversion to Christianity, he hunted down other Christians to be jailed, imprisoned, persecuted, possibly killed. We're perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Way before Chumbawamba saying, I get knocked down, but I'll get up again, right? Paul was saying in the first century. I imagine his version of the song was better too, like let's just be honest. He goes on, there's suffering. Our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. Look, we're going to face suffering. And in fact, it's really important to know, if you're a follower of Jesus, that you'll still face suffering. All right, and I've said this before, it's worth repeating. Yeah, our faith is not a shield against suffering, but a pathway through it. Paul says, you will face suffering. That will happen. That's going to happen. But in the midst of it, right, there's a death that happens when you face suffering, like an internal death, sometimes an external death, but an internal death. But it's actually in holding this death of Jesus. It's like we're sharing in the death of Jesus when we have this suffering that we go through, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in us. In other words, bad things happen, we experience suffering, but also because there's a hope and a life inside of us, our response to the bad things ends up showing the world that there's a different way. It's in our suffering, in sharing in the death of Jesus, that we get to present to them the life of Jesus also. It's not cynicism all the way down. It's the belief that even when I'm walking through suffering, there is still hope in the world. He goes on and says this. This is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and they won't last very long. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. Paul's essentially saying, look, never give up. Never, ever, ever give up. Because you gotta understand, what we're going through right now, all the trials, the tribulations, the suffering, the tragedy, it's for a season. It's for a season. And God is renewing and restoring and reconciling all things. And he is looking for partners. He is calling the church into his renewal project. And there will come a day when Christ returns and everything is renewed and restored and reconciled. But the work starts now. The work starts now. And so those of you who are followers of Jesus, don't walk through the world hopeless. It would be easy to. There are countless examples you can point to of politicians who are corrupt, of churches who do only want your money, of governments that only want authoritarian power, of people who are only in it for themselves, of do-gooders who have to post it all on social media because it's really, at the end of the day, all about them. Sure, you will find that if that's what you're looking for. But if you're looking for something different, God has placed jars of clay, human beings filled with the love of Christ and the hope of Jesus all around the world. And when we face suffering, that's actually when the love and life of Christ can be most evident. That's hope. That's hope, okay? So, my mom likes to buy ornamental flags to put at the end of the driveway, right? It's a hobby. Okay, so last 4th of July, she had found this one that she really liked called, it said red, white, and blessed, right? It's a 4th of July thing, red, white, and blue. Instead of that, it's red, white, and blessed. It's like saying, I live in America, but also I love Jesus. It's a cute little thing my mom did. But my dad's colorblind. So what he saw was white and blessed. And he drove into the driveway and saw it and ran to the door. Betty, why did you buy that sign? And she said, I thought it was cute. So then it took him a while to get there, right? But he finally figured out, it doesn't say white and blessed. It says red, white, and blessed. Great. See, the thing is, colorblindness, it prevents us from seeing the world as it really is. That's what, if you have colorblindness, you know that. And then some of you who are really smart, you figured out, I'm not talking about colorblindness at all. Cynicism prevents us from seeing the world as it really is. It's easy to see the bad in the world. And let's be clear, the scripture is fully aware of the bad in the world. Over and over again, we talk about, scripture talks about how, yes, every inclination of the human heart is evil at this point because we've turned our backs against God. But over and over again, there's the announcement that in the beginning, God created and it was good. And what God wants is to get back to the good. And then those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to participate in the good, to be a force of good for the world all around us. And like the world then doesn't have to be seen through the eyes of cynicism, but rather through the eyes of hope. But here's the problem, right? This whole series on sharing hope, you can't share hope if you don't have hope. So for the burned out, and the worn out, and the exhausted, and the angry, and the disappointed. For those of you who arrived at a cynical outlook, not because you didn't care, but because you did. Please remember that the hope of the world does not rest in the headlines of the evening news. The hope of the world actually rests in those of us who choose to follow after Jesus and then live a life according to his way. And therefore, we collectively can actually be a part of a solution here and not just pointing at the problem. It gives us a desire, right, to share the hope that we have with the world and a belief that the church should be a force for good in the world. Like we should. And here's the thing, like the world isn't getting a lot better. Now, listen, I say that as a very specific way of talking about this. Obviously, technology has increased, poverty has decreased, more people are being fed around the world than they have before. There's a lot to be thankful for about the way things have gone in the 2,000 years between Jesus and now, right? But what I mean by this is not that nothing's getting better. What I mean by this is that we still have the issue of human sin. And as long as that is still an issue, like all technology will give us is the ability to do more good, yes, but also more evil. And so the world is not getting better, but here's the thing, and I have to wonder if this isn't part of the reason. I think it may be because there aren't enough of us with a vision that it could be better who are willing to ensure that it is. If you are looking through if you're looking at the world through cynical eyes, then you will decide that it's hopeless and there's no point in going on. Just like we can't really make a difference, so we might as well just like go about our day, do the best we can. We'll come to church, we'll study the scriptures, but we'll try to follow Jesus, but we'll just do that and then we'll just make it. We'll just get through it. But in Timothy, Paul, just as a reminder, right? We looked at this already. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. And by doing this, they will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future so that they may experience true life. If I were to just summarize the commands of Paul here and the way of life that Jesus calls us into, right? As it relates to the other people around us, be generous with your time, be generous with your money. It's fairly simple. It's fairly simple. Love God, love the world, right? And the way we love the world is in part, at least, to be generous with our time, be generous with our money. Here's our problem in the United States in 2022. Our idols are time and money. The things that we are the most hesitant to give away are time and money. Like, I'm just going to name this because, listen, I am no different than you in this. I grew up in this culture as well. I also like to reserve all of my time for myself. If it were solely up to me and Jesus had not done a great work in my heart, I would probably just watch movies about 18 hours a day. I love movies. But you know what I wouldn't have done if I were doing that? Anything. I wouldn't have been able to marry the woman that I'm privileged to be married to. I wouldn't have been able to raise the children that I'm privileged to be able to raise. I wouldn't be able to be a part of a faith community where we get to tell other people about the hope that's in Jesus. I wouldn't get to see what it's like to actually spend some of my time investing in others and investing in great things in the community, and I wouldn't be changed because of that. See, here's our problem, I think. Like, time and money, like none of us want to give our time away. We don't give that does not come natural for most of us. What's fascinating is when we finally start to actually do it, we start to realize, like, this is awesome. It's in starting that's so difficult, though. Because our problem is that we're not convinced that doing good in the church does good in the world. I think we're not convinced of that. And I think one of the reasons we're not convinced of that is because all of us, through cynical eyes, can point to examples of the church that were unhelpful, unhealthy, hypocritic, like all those. Of course we can point to that. But here's what I know. Here's what I know. I talked to a young woman years ago in Pennsylvania. And we basically had a Sunday where I had said at the end of the service, hey, if you find Jesus appealing, but for some reason you found Christians wholly unappealing, I'm going to be right down here after the service is over, and I would love to have a conversation with you about that if that's interesting to you. So I had a young lady, she's probably 20, 22 years old. She came down, she was still a college student. And I said, so she said, I'm one of those people. She said, I find Jesus appealing, but the evidence I'm seeing right by looking at the church, not that appealing. So I was like, so what is it that's not that appealing for you? Like, you tell me your story, right? Everybody's got a story. When they get to cynicism, like if they're honest with themselves and if they're willing to be honest with you, they've got a story. And so she just basically said, this story about, hey, she grew up in a home where her parents, went to church regularly, but her father was verbally abusive and her mother was an alcoholic. And so she saw that all growing up. And she knew some other people in the youth group that she'd grown up who had a very similar situation at home, parents that would come to church and clean up well on Sundays, but then live very differently the rest of the week. And she had grown up with that over and over and over again. That had been, when she thinks of Christians, when she thinks of church, that's what she thinks of. Fair, that's what she's seen. That's what she's seen. And so we're just standing there, and I'm looking around the room as she's talking, and I'm just seeing different families who I know personally. And I say to her, hey, just turn around a second. So I said, look over there. That family couldn't have children. And so they wanted to adopt, and what they decided to do was to adopt some kids from the poorest countries in the world so that they could bring some kids up out of poverty, even though those kids didn't look like them. They came from a totally different culture, and it's been really, really hard for them. They're here every Sunday, though, worshiping and hoping and sharing because God has changed their life around. I pointed to another couple. I was like, hey, actually, she lost her husband several years ago. Unexpectedly, they were both in their 20s at the time. And she was mad at God for a little while, but then she started to really feel like Jesus was calling her back to participate in the life of a church. And she's married to somebody else now, and that little girl she's holding, like that little girl's new. She has been through great suffering, but she is still here and she is still hopeful. And I was able to just go around the room and I said, see, you, like story after story, I was just able to say, look, see, when you were growing up, what you experienced of the church was bad and you had to deal with that. Now I'm showing you this and you have to deal with that too. Because a lot of times, right, the experiences that we have aren't indicative of what the whole is like. When you start to see how people's lives can actually be changed by following after Jesus, you'll start to believe that maybe what would be really helpful for as many people as possible is to connect them with Jesus. And therefore, the good work that we do within the church is also good work for the whole world. That's where you can start to get to. Now, here's some realities here at Inland Hills Church over the last. We took a survey a month ago, and we keep bringing you interesting data as we're kind of mining it and checking it out. Here's a few things. First of all, 40% of our congregation is new to Inland Hills in the last 3 years. It's a huge number. So when you look around on Sunday mornings, this service, the 11 o'clock service, 40% of the people there were new in the last 3 years. And another 5% are still in the checking it out phase. So 45% of the people you see on the average Sunday morning are new in the last 3 years, basically. Here's the other thing that's true for us. In the last 18 months, Inland Hills Church has had a 70% increase in attendance in the last 18 months. We're very grateful for that. Here's the beautiful thing about that. We have so many more kids now than we had 18 months ago. Here's the challenging thing about that. We have so many more kids now than we did 18 months ago, okay? So I'm talking with our team over the last week or so, and we're just talking about, like, hey, in this Share Hope series, like, what is one of the things that we should push for? And look, I just felt like if you believe that Jesus is the hope of the world, and the church is the representative, like the holder of that hope, that in these jars of clay in our bodies, like we're supposed to hold, like we steward this hope of the world, and that's supposed to make us a force for good in the world, right? To pull others into it. That's kind of the deal. Well, then I really want you to consider joining our dream team to help us make a difference in the world. We need about 90 more people to be willing to give of their time in order to make a difference here at Inland Hills Church, because we have way more people than we did 18 months ago, but we have the same amount of staff. Actually, we have a few less staff. So what I would love is for a few of you to really, really thoughtfully consider the possibility of joining our dream team, our volunteer team here at Inland Hills Church, because we need about 90 people more than what we have. So here's what we're going to do. Next Sunday and the Sunday after that, we're going to do a Dream Team double day. We're going to try to double the size of our Dream Team over the course of a couple of days. So here's what I really want you to do. If you're interested in this is not a commitment to do it. I want you to text the word team to this number right here. And if you're watching online or if you're listening to the podcast in the car, it's 844-813-8255. 2695. If you'll just text the word team to this number, you'll get an automatic reply from us, and we'll remind you to sign up for it later today, right? After you go home and you do football and whatever else, you've forgotten totally about it, we'll text you later today to remind you. Here's what the church desperately needs to care about being a force for good in the world. And here at Inland Hills Church, we need more people to join our dream team so that we can keep reaching more people with the gospel. We're in a really exciting time. I've been here 3 years. I have never been more excited about the future of this church than I am right now. That's just me. I just want you to know that, though. We're seeing lots of amazing things happen. We have story upon story to share with you over the coming months. I'm really excited about that. We need more people to be willing to give of their time. And look, I know that time is precious, and people would oftentimes rather write a check than give of their time. If you're a follower of Jesus who calls this church your home, I want you to consider, though, that you really should do both. We need to give, I do, lots of you do. But if you're not giving of your time and your finances, of your generosity to the Lord, I would just consider I would urge you to consider that, to consider doing it, okay? It's not a guilt trip, it's an opportunity. We need more, that's true, but also when you talk to people who have actually served and actually met other people where they are, and met their needs, and been a part of other people interacting and engaging with the gospel, you will find that it was well worth their time and effort. And here's the final thing this morning, okay? So hopefully you've got the phone number down and you've texted team at this point. Again, you're not obligating yourself by texting this. You're just letting us know you're interested, and then we'll let you know over the next couple of Sundays you have the opportunity to shadow somebody to see if it's the kind of thing you'd like to do, right? And we have a number of opportunities for you to serve in all kinds of ministries, in kids ministries, in tech ministry, on the worship team. There's just lots of opportunities, and we'd love for you to shadow and see if it's for you. We're not going to put you in something you hate forever, okay? That's not our goal. Our goal is to connect you and your passion with the world's deep need. That's what we want to do. So let us know what you're passionate about. And then shadow someone and see if it makes sense. We'd love to do that for you. And then finally today, I'd love for you to consider giving to our Share Hope offering to help us make a difference in the world. So we're going to do that in just a moment. We're going to get to Share Hope. Here's how we're going to do it. There's going to be buckets that come around. We haven't passed buckets since before COVID. But, no one's licked these, so we think that we're okay. And if you would try not to sneeze directly into it as it comes around to you, we'd really appreciate that. So any loose cash that we get, right? If you have $5, $20, $50, several millions of dollars in cash with you today, whatever you give, you can put that in the bucket. Any cash or change that we get in the bucket will go outside of our doors. It all goes to our Share Hope, our Share Hope budget, which is all money that we just give away. We don't keep a dollar of it. We give it all away. If you're writing a check in the memo, just write Share Hope. Just write Share Hope in the memo so that we know to put that in the Share Hope, and all that goes out our doors. If you're online, right, there's a few ways to give. One of the ways you can give is online. You can go to our website, inlandhills.com/give. And when you click on the link there, you'll be able to select the Share Hope fund as what you want to give to, right? So all the change that comes in goes to Share Hope. Everybody who writes Share Hope in the memo goes to Share Hope. Everybody who selects Share Hope as the account they're giving to online or on their mobile phone, that all goes to Share Hope. We would love for you to give, right? For those of you who call Inland Hills Church your home, we'd love for you to give over and above what you would normally give for a tithe to this today so that we can give money out all over the world. We just packaged over 200,000 meals just a little while ago to give out to the world. It's awesome. And the cost of that was about $50,000. And we all this money will go to the cost of that, plus everything else we can do outside of that if we get more than 50. So that's what we're doing today. And really hope that you, over the next few moments, would just consider what it is that the Lord may be leading you to give. If you want to share hope with the world, we give of our time, we give of our money. And we choose to be rich in our own generosity because that's how Jesus redefines wealth for us. I'm going to have our ushers start to head forward, and we're going to take up the offering now. Our band's going to lead us out, and I'll come up and close us in prayer in just a moment.
Days may be darkest, but your light is greater. You light our way, God, you light our way. When evil is rising, you're rising higher with power to save, with power to save. hope alive. You keep hope alive from the beginning to end. Your word never fails. You keep hope alive because you are alive. Jesus, you are alive. Death has a stronghold, but your life was stronger. Rose from the grave, rose up from the grave. When evil is rising, you're rising higher. With power to save, with power to save. Oh, you keep hope alive. You keep hope alive from the beginning to end. Your word never fails. You keep hope alive because you are alive. Jesus, you are alive. There's hope in the morning, hope in the evening, hope because you're living, hope because you're breathing. There's hope in the breaking, hope in the sorrow, hope for this moment. My hope is for tomorrow. There's hope in the morning. There's hope in the evening. There's hope because you're living. There's hope because you're breathing. There's hope in the breaking. There's hope in the sorrow. There's hope for this moment. My hope is for tomorrow. You keep hope alive. You keep hope alive. Oh, your word never fails. You keep hope alive because you are alive. Jesus, you are alive. You keep hope alive. You keep hope alive from the beginning to end. You keep hope alive because you are alive. Oh, Jesus, you are alive. You keep hope alive. You keep hope alive from the beginning to end. Your word never, come on, church. You keep hope alive because you are alive. Jesus, you are alive.
Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we're so grateful, Lord, that you sent Jesus and that you've given us a hope that surpasses understanding, a hope that surpasses what the world around us may be able to cling to. And so, Lord, let us push back on cynicism and let us continue to give generously of our time and our money so that we can be a force of good in the world all around us. Thank you so much for the awesome work that I've gotten to see this congregation do over the last several weeks as we've shared hope with those around us. Thank you for the money given today. Thank you for the meals packed over the last several weeks. Thank you for the community service projects our small groups have done over the last several weeks. It's been awesome to see. May it continue to be a source of hope for others. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.